just do a little introduction here. Eli received a PhD in performance studies from Northwestern University in 2014, held a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at Vassar College from 2014 to 2016, and currently is a Cesar Chavez postdoctoral fellow in Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies at Dartmouth College. Their book project, Transvocality and Hemispheric Music Performance, centers the singing voice as a sonic lens for the performance practices of transgender musicians in North, Central, and South America. They have published in various journals and edited anthologies, and their dissertation was awarded the Philip Brett Award for exceptional musicological work in the field of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, transgender studies from the American Musicological Society in 2015. So please welcome Eli. And today's talk, Racing Away, Queer of Color Critique and the New Old Queer.
Thanks, David. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that. I'm just going to set my timer on to keep myself honest. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. Then I won't do this. So this paper takes up the call to interrogate the implied radicality of queer, right, as an analytic, and asks what the social, artistic, and theoretical movement of trans or transgender brings to this conversation. First, I examine how the emergence of trans has potentially, inadvertently, and effectively augmented the surreptitious racialization of queer, to borrow a phrase from Angela Davis. Second, I'm going to spend a few minutes thinking through the mechanics of radical modifiers. I love this term that our conveners have given us. How do they work, right? What are their effects? How do they come into being? And what are their effects once they are in circulation? Third, I explore some areas in which musicology might be particularly well positioned to do queer and trans theorizing that centers race, class, and the productively embarrassed, etc. Part 1, trans, or the new, old, queer. Trans topics have exploded, as many of us know, in recent years, and are often framed, trans is often framed as an identity, positionality, and or an analytic that unsettles aspects of embodiment, identity, and politics that even queer can't account for, right? The assertion that gender and morphology can be distinct fundamentally changed queer and feminist work, but as many of us here are aware, and as trans of color theorists first pointed out, we should be wary of the radicality of trans, if for no other reason than it seems suspiciously similar to that of queer. In the classroom and in scholarship, I see trans performing all of the same exclusions that women and queer have done in the queer and feminist activist and academic movements in the US in the past 50 years, and one could argue prior to that as well. As Becky Thompson has shown, women of color feminism emerged in tandem, not in response to white feminism, but was often ignored by the latter and is often framed as responding to it. 2 or 3 decades later, queer of color critique really grew into being as a discourse in the academy to address the racism in much canonical queer theory. And it's interesting, I think, to note that the timing of trans in this sequence emerged just when queer of color critique was coming into its own in the early to mid 2000s. A cynical reading of this timing, but I think it's one we should consider, is that trans became a way for white, queer, and feminist folks to make the conversation about them again. For example, in the past 5 years or so, practices with regard to trans etiquette have taken a front seat in pedagogy, often in the form of trans 101s. While offering some useful information, the affective structure of these sessions potentially folds neatly into a neoliberal ethic of care in which the academy treats students as consumers to be placated. What is covered over in this whole conversation is any critique offered in both women of color and male queer of color theory of the ways in which etiquette itself is intrinsically a race, national, and class concept. Further, it elides the question of who is being made to feel more comfortable in the classroom, or at least being made to feel that some effort is made regardless of its efficacy, and who is not, as well as who is supposed to be included in the rubric of trans, which itself elides the ways trans, of course, is a race, class, and geographically specific appellation. I've written an article recently that's forthcoming in the issue of Blackness of Transgender Studies Quarterly that argues, drawing from the work of B. Binauhan and Marlon Ross, that hard distinctions between, and other folks have argued this too, so I'm kind of bringing them together, that hard distinctions between the categories of cisgender, transgender, and even transfeminine and transmasculine only really hold in a non-intersectional frame. A Black transfeminist critique, I think, would insist, would insist that we center those who are the most marginalized, right? That's one of the core tenets of Black feminism, that we center those who are the most marginalized in our conversations about power in order to account for as many vectors as possible that are at work in those fields. And thus, it would cause us to revise, doing so causes us to revise the fundamental categories that are operative in trans studies and transfeminism. And I think pedagogy and theory are linked here, and I'm going to go back and forth between sort of thinking about pedagogy and theory this morning. The anxiety, I think, with regard to trans etiquette, is premised upon a privilege of those who feel entitled to sort of these calls for care and for rightness, right? And so there's a universalization of whiteness in trans theory that in turn buttresses the pedagogy, right? So part of how trans, I would argue, has whitened conversations on gender and sexuality, again, has to do, I think, with the great amount of anxiety that emerges around this topic of trans etiquette, right? I think some anxiety is useful and necessary for change, right? Audre Lorde said that change is kind of inherently painful in some ways. But a culture of anxiety, I think, traffics in shame, right? And shame naturalizes anxiety, I think. So rather than keeping the focus on the micro and macro structures of power, it turns one into a bad pedagogue or a political being or a bad person, right, for saying the wrong thing, and makes intellectually challenging conversations around intersectionality all the more difficult. One of the ways I think we might address anxiety in the classroom, and I'm speaking here as somebody who teaches predominantly in gender studies, right, so I'm interested to hear how those of us who teach in musicology and ethnomusicology might have a different set of concerns. But hopefully this is still relevant or helpful in some way. But one of the ways we might address anxiety in the classroom, I think, which is warranted when we attempt to interrogate critical concepts that are also dearly held identities, right? Maybe to be able to untangle for ourselves and our students the differences between an identity, a positionality, and an analytic. I want to offer 3 working definitions and argue that they increase in their need and ability to be flexed and pushed and challenged. An identity, I would argue, is a personally held belief about oneself. Positionality is relational, and it's based on one's self-understood but not solely self-determined relation to others and systems of power. An analytic is what we do with a concept, right? It's how it helps us think. These terms increase in their ability and, as I said, need to be flexed as they move from left to right. There's little to no utility, I would argue, in critiquing someone's identity, but trans, or any other term, has to be flexed, in fact, to do any analytical work whatsoever, and the more the better, perhaps. Part 2, or the making of a feminist killjoy. That's Sarah Ahmed's phrase, not mine. I want to take the opportunity proffered by our conveners today to consider how any term comes to be understood as radical. How does it work? What are the effects of that production? There are 2 core components of how implied radical modifiers work that I can lay out now. First, they're not to be questioned. You're studying glitter as a resistant, you're critiquing glitter as a resistant sartorial strategy in queer nightlife? Why would you critique that? Right? Of course, there are high stakes involved, right, in questioning already marginalized work. And we're potentially giving people looking for a reason not to do this work an excuse to throw up their hands and say, see, I knew it wasn't worth the trouble, right? All this anti-racist queer work, it's just too hard, we're not going to do it. The fact is, as we know, there is no return to the universal subject because it never existed. And this trouble, I think, around how to do this difficult work gives us an opportunity to get to know our own and others' queer objects that much better. So there's something uninterrogatable, if I could just make up a really ugly word, about implicitly radical concepts, right? That we're not supposed to question them. Perhaps this is because of a conflation of identity, positionality, and analytic. I pose that as a question, perhaps. At the same time that I want to parse out those three frames, identity, positionality, analytic, I am, of course, deeply invested in keeping in play the material conditions that buttress theoretical elisions, right? Queer men of color who tokenize women of color in their research, for example, are able to do so in part because of the disproportionate absence of queer women of color in secure positions in the academy, right? So these elisions are tied to actual material elisions, of course. Hiram Perez has argued that whiteness is both invisible and mutable, adapting to whatever would expose it. We could say then, perhaps, that the radicality of queer and trans is a manifestation of a kind of bodily to theoretical osmosis, wherein inscrutability is attributed to queer and trans theory through the invisibility of normative whiteness. So once we have an implied radical term, queer and trans, what are its effects? I've already shown that it's unquestionable, right? And that unquestionability leaves the exclusionary mechanisms operative within them intact, right? If you don't question it, then whatever it's doing that isn't perhaps totally inclusive kind of goes under the radar. Second, they boomerang the focus of the critique from the object to the examiner. You want to critique the study of glitter as a queer sartorial practice of resistance? What's wrong with you? Right? It becomes about what's wrong with you rather than what the critique is about. So I think a litmus test for any term we might want to ascertain if it is an implied radical term is whether it turns those who would question it into feminist killjoys, to use Sarah Ahmed's beautiful phrase. Though these points may seem obvious, I hope they might be useful tools as we move forward, seeking analytics and methods in musicology that don't presume the very radicality, in and outside of musicology, that we don't presume the very radicality we want them to do for us. Right? To highlight the material within this theoretical venture, again, I think we need to be really wary of how this boomerang effect enters into a long history of attributing anger, irrationality, and emotionality onto people of color who question the norm, right? So particularly people of color who are calling out, for example, the dominant structures in an institution, right, where it becomes about that person becoming the angry person of color. I hope that for today and tomorrow that we can, as the keynote speaker so beautifully set up for us yesterday, kind of keep in play the differing effects or the different stakes and effects of racing queer theory for different people performing it, right? This seems especially important in musicology and the performing arts, where embodied pedagogy is not only theorized but also done. How can our practices of singing, speaking, and playing music in the classroom embolden a project of race and queer music scholarship and vice versa? To sum up this section, the intersection of theory and pedagogy, I think, offers much to a larger conversation of how to make academic institutions places where those occupying positions of difference are allowed to thrive, rather than being seen as sufficient to fill a school's diversity quotient and then being made to bear the burden of representing that difference. Right? And of course, I'm talking about dominantly white institutions, which is most institutions. Right. Part 3. Singing is to speaking as silence is to sound. Third, I think musicology offers particular capabilities with regard to race and queer scholarship. After thinking about what intersectional listening means for the past 9 years now, one of the few things I can say with assurance that I think such a practice necessitates is a respect for and valorization of silence. I remember when I was an undergraduate at Oberlin, sitting in Arnie Cox's music theory 3 class, how he, some people here were in that class, weird and awesome, how he explained how a full measure rest after Ophelia falls into the river in both Berlioz's Nuit d'été draws our in ear, draws our ear in we want to listen for the sound, and thus we are sort of pulled into the river with her. So silence, I think, and there's many other examples, but I'm really excited by musicology's embrace of harmony, noise, and silence as constitutive elements of music. I think this valorization shouldn't be taken for granted. I'm wary of trans and any other etiquette that takes itself super seriously precisely because it's hard to hear through anxiety. It's hard to hear through anxiety that accompanies the fear of not knowing everything, right? Of not knowing how to say it so that it comes out perfectly, harmony, of saying the wrong thing, noise, or of not knowing what to say at all, silence, right? Perhaps that's the worst of all. It seems to me that this non-musical approach to having political conversations is counterproductive. A disdain for silence covers over the ways in which, for example, tiptoeing around is itself erased in class and national practice that sounds different in different contexts. Carrying over this valorization and respect for silence from music to our political theoretical conversations might be a way to move toward deeply intersectional sounds. And then, of course, I heard Professor Vargas's brilliant keynote yesterday, and Professor Jones's, both of their kind of incorporation of the body and of dissonant noise and erotic sounds, and now I'm like, silence, who wants that? Right? Like, I think there's a lot of different ways that we can think about how we would want to have intersectional conversations, so feel free to challenge me on any of that. But I think, all that said, I think allowing for silence is in some ways revolutionary in an industry where we are under constant pressure to expel verbal acumen as an indication of our commitment, intelligence, and training. Right? It actually takes a lot of courage to allow for silence to hang in the air, I think, when we don't quite have the answer. Today, I think, and during the next, and tomorrow, we have an opportunity to not only shift the conversation, we've already shifted the conversation, I'm so excited for that, but also what conversation sounds like. What if we allowed uncomfortable silence to fill the space, for example? How often when our students do work under the rubric of trans is their work intersectional? How able are we to point them to sources that would help them when we know intuitively their work is lacking but are hard-pressed to trip sources off the tongue, when we're beset by requests from colleagues, editors, students, other students in our lives outside of work? A valuing of silence that acknowledges that we need time to find these sources, sometimes not because we're bad political subjects, but because of institutional erasures with long racialized histories. And I think reframing that from the micro to the macro, to include the macro, might actually galvanize us to redress those elisions more effectively. A few minutes of research, it might rid us of our sort of internal dialogue and critique, our noise, right? Long enough to realize that we actually know how to find trans and queer of color work really quickly. A few minutes of research on Google, for example, might lead us to 3 sources that I would love for everyone to have on their shelf if they don't already, namely the new 2015 edition of This Bridge Called Me Back, the edited collection Queer Necropolitics that came out in 2014, and anything by C. Riley Snorton, especially his essay in the second Transgender Studies Reader, his work on Who's Out in Hip Hop, and his forthcoming book with Minnesota Press on the figuration of blackness and elision of blackness in trans history. I read contemporary trans of color discourse as continuing a conversation, of course, that queer and women of color began, rather than marking itself as distinct from the fields in which it draws in the ways that white trans theory has tended to do. And I can offer many examples of this if you like. But if trans of color theorizing has remained transparently indebted to queer of color theorizing, it's not because we are somehow more agreeable than white trans theorists or more copacetic. It's because we can't as easily afford to throw out the ideas and the people attached to them. In this way, musicology has something in common with trans of color theorizing. We are a rather small community. We have one major conference, and many other important ones too, but one major one, and in my experience attending AMS from 2010 to 2016, it seems to me that perhaps ironically, the white middle class sense of respect and decorum that permeates AMS generates an atmosphere of mutual respect and accountability to one another, if for no other reason that we know we're going to see each other soon, right? We know we're going to be reading and revising each other's work. But I think that this ethic of accountability, whether or not it's always followed, is resonant with an ethic of care that's integral to anti-racist queer theorizing. We might queer the pitch, again, at which musicology vibrates, following the model of our predecessors and interrogating our analytics as we go, this time drawing from queer and trans of color scholarship, but also art, music, and activism, since so many of our queer and trans of color scholars, especially women, are not in our institutions yet. In conclusion, singing is to speaking as silence is to sound. That is, silence is not only a prerogative for listening, right? I think it is really important to, it's hard to learn as somebody who loves to speak, that silence is important to be able to actually listen. Not only is silence a prerogative for listening, but it's also a fun, risk-free, because it's in our heads, an unpredictable way of stringing together thoughts. Silence may enable us, if we allow it, to listen to our orientation to our work. For example, learning whether it comes from shame, I'm not blank enough, I'm not radical enough, I'm not smart enough, etc. Or I'm the native informant on X, so I have to write about X and compete with everybody else who's writing about that, right? A particular way that scholars of color internalize white supremacy and actually act it out on each other. Learning kind of what our orientation to our work is and kind of paying attention to that more closely, I think is crucial for us to grow as scholars and for a self-reflexive praxis of race and queer music scholarship. We might then understand shame. I'm just using shame as an example because I'm reading a book by Brene Brown. But also, does anybody know who Brene Brown is? All right. But it's also, I think, a universal phenomenon. We might understand shame as a starting place, right? Not a destination island onto which to silo ourselves and people, but a beginning point that helps us discover where we are and where we want to go. So it's useful. In fine, that is what I wish for queer and trans as racial analytics, that they become tools that we carry on our creative intellectual journeys, much like the items in the luggage most of us packed to get here today. They enable us to negotiate our intellectual journey. And they're items that we've integrated to our beings, to ourselves, that we've selected ourselves, that we've selected from our items into thinking about our journey and what we might need, right? And so we've integrated them. They are unique and they're idiosyncratic to us. Queer and trans scholarship isn't about other people, it's about me in some sort of way, because I've thought about this work and have some sort of relationship to it that is complex and different, but it's not this other thing. At least that's what I hope. And whose utility, these queer and trans analytics as tools, whose utility we can never completely predict, and on a journey we can never entirely anticipate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A wonderful way. Is this working or? Well, they want me to use it, so when people have questions, you can speak into this and we'll help for the recording of it. So I'm going to have to play Oprah and move around. But I think we have time for one question. I just want to keep us on schedule. But with a group as close as this, I'm sure we can constantly ask each other questions during the course of the conference and all of that. So one question, here we are. So Clara.
Not so bad for getting the question. I wondered if I could, thank you so much. It was really, really exciting. I wanted to talk about it with you. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about shame. And you said earlier that it neutralizes anxiety. And I wonder if you could think a little bit about that and talk about how the neutralization of anxiety would relate to pleasure, because shame also can be production of pleasure, in some different analytics. So why does shame neutralize anxiety? And then how does it get to pleasure? Because anxiety is not pleasurable, for me at least. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. Just one point of clarification. I didn't say neutralize, I said naturalize. It's related, right? But just, yeah, shame naturalizes anxiety. I'm going to skip to the pleasure part because I think I think we know that. I think that pleasure can also be can also manifest various forms of white supremacy, right? We can think about how Black women in particular are put into positions in which they become the mammy, right? Scolding the white scholars for not doing work the way that they're supposed to be doing. And there's a kind of pleasure in being scolded. Because if someone's telling you what to do, you don't have to take responsibility and figure it out yourself. And you also know your place. And I think that that not only relies on really racist tropes of emotional labor and intellectual labor, but it's also just a little bit lazy and not productive for intersectional conversations, right? So that's one aspect of pleasure that I immediately thought of with, and I think it also works with the trans shaming, right? There's good reason, for example, for having etiquette around like find out what someone's pronoun is from someone else who knows them, and then just try and use it, right? Like, there's good reasons to try and do that. It does actually make me uncomfortable when people use my pronoun wrong. I'm just speaking for myself, obviously. But like, at the same time, I'm not interested in that. It's not very interesting. I kind of just want to move on to, you know, whatever, all of the other things that are more important than that and more interesting than that. And so shame, the reason I said shame naturalizes anxiety is because it's all sort of becomes about that moment, right? And it becomes all about the person who made that mistake. At least in most of in the conversations in Latino studies and gender studies that I'm mostly centered into. It may be different in different disciplines. But does that sort of answer?
Thank you very much. Sorry we had to cut.
Thank you.